All right, thank you. And I'd like to welcome everyone. We're right at 4 o'clock, and this is our second week of the 2026 ARCA Virtual Learning Institute. We're so glad that you're here. Throughout the month of May, ARCA is hosting a series of presentations on disability-focused content and content to support rehabilitation counselors, students, and educators. This presentation today is Motivational Interviewing in Practice, Supporting Recovery and Community Engagement in Psychiatric Disabilities. A few quick reminders. Please make sure that you keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking. And if you have questions, please use the chat. We'll monitor the questions as they come up. And we'll do the best we can to catch them as they come through. I'd like to take a moment to thank our speaker, Dr. Michael Walsh, for sharing his time and expertise with us today. Dr. Walsh is an associate professor in neuropsychiatry and behavioral science at the great state University of South Carolina. Woohoo! Go Gamecocks. Mike studied motivational interviewing with Master Motivational Interviewing instructor Alan Lime and continues his learning whenever he can. Mike designs and delivers professional trainings in motivational interviewing on a regular basis and remains an avid student of the approach. In addition to his work as a counselor educator, Mike has had spent 14 years running a small mental health agency that specialized in psychiatric rehabilitation as the executive and clinical director, and probably bottle washer too. Mike is a certified psychiatric rehab practitioner and currently serves on the board of the Psychiatric Rehabilitation Association. He serves on the PRA Certification Commission and the CPRP and CFRP Exam Revision Task Force. Mike has authored and delivered well over 100 local and national presentations and trainings in the area, as diverse as professional skill development, motivational interviewing, adult learning and training, and psychiatric rehabilitation, and lots more. Mike, thanks so much for being here, and I will turn the mic over to you.
Well, thanks very much. Appreciate having me, and I appreciate seeing all of you. I can't see too many faces, so I'm gonna just kind of get started here. I first sort of learned about motivational interviewing when I was in my master's program. I got the second edition, I think, of the book, and as I read it, I got kind of more and more interested and excited about a person-centered way of interacting with people. And what I appreciated about it is it wasn't a series of techniques, and we'll get into that a little bit. But I was also very involved in the psychiatric rehab space, and so the idea of operating from a strength-based perspective, operating from a client value-based perspective, was really a great fit with what I was learning was sort of some of the best practices in psychiatric rehabilitation. So I'd like to share a little bit with you about that process. So let's get started. We'll jump on in. And a special thanks to Alan Lime. Alan Lime, I went to an MI training with him through a grant, and he was fantastic. He was really kind in letting me, he said, here's all my slides. You use as much of them as you like. So if you see a blue background on any slide, that's an Alan Lime slide. So we will thank him as we go along. So let's get started here. What are we going to do? We're going to do an overview of the lived experience of psychiatric disabilities. There's a very specific thing that I want to touch on, an overview of MI, and then sort of for use in the psych rehab space, we're going to take a look at the stages of change, specifically in psych rehab, and how that layers into MI, and then take a look at some of the four fundamental processes in MI, and finally take a look at skill building in MI and how that works. So that's the plan for today. This is something I really wanted to touch base on. Pat Deegan is somebody who has been writing. She had schizophrenia. And her story and her background is really interesting. She was a high school athlete, and at 17, 18 years old, I think she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and was a basketball player, and so that was her main focus. And her experience after having been diagnosed was doctors telling her, "Listen, you need to take it easy. You need to not get stressed out. You need to stop playing. You need to stop, going to school. You need to make your mental health appointments and take your meds." And she said she spent 2 years sitting on her grandmother's porch, smoking cigarettes and drinking Coke. And she said, "This isn't a life. I want more than this." So she actually went out and got back to school, got her PhD, and studies and writes about the experience of schizophrenia. And so this idea that psychiatrically disabled adults don't get rehabilitated, but rather they recover, and and then they sort of choose new and valued sense of self and purpose, and through the recovery process they become active, responsible participants in their own rehabilitation project. So it's a little different than traditionally. The mental health system certainly has seen psychiatric rehabilitation. That is traditionally, anyway, been something that is outwardly driven. And what we know about human beings is that human beings do better when they find their own perspectives, answers, when they start to drive the process. And that's really the point that Pat Deegan's making here. Um, the lived experience of psychiatric disability, and this comes from a large World Health study that was done recently, I think in 2022. This also comes out of the literature surrounding psychiatric rehabilitation. Folks report a loss of a sense of self, a loss of autonomy, and a sense of self-efficacy. We certainly heard that in Pat Deegan's story. Report loneliness and isolation, a loss of hope, a loss of a sense of agency, and oftentimes a disconnection with family. Families want to see they've seen this person well, and then they've seen that person not well, and they just want to kind of get back to stable. And that sort of search for stable oftentimes comes at the expense of autonomy and growth for the individual. Um, for really well-meaning purposes, but it's important to kind of keep in the front of our minds that the best practices in psych rehab have to do with fostering a sense of autonomy and fostering a sense of hope, fostering agency, fostering self-efficacy, fostering decision making, that kind of thing. So we'll take a look at how we can use the techniques that we're going to talk about to do that. And fundamentally, the crux of the issue is people with psychiatric disabilities are, because of mental illness, for a while at least, unable to attain age and culture appropriate goals for extended periods of time. So, good recovery oriented practice helps people to begin to dream again, helps people to begin to connect with those goals, those ideas, those roles that maybe they were a part of, maybe they were an employee, maybe they were a brother, sister, community member, church member, and they've lost touch with that for one reason or another. We can help people begin to imagine what the possibilities could be to reclaim some of those roles. And so when you think about good recovery oriented practice, what I like to think about is what adult roles, normal adult roles, might that person like to get back to? And that's very much a conversation that is centered in the values of the individual. It's centered in the goals of the individual. Even when that person maybe is experiencing and managing psychiatric symptoms, makes it difficult for them to imagine what's next. We can let somebody borrow a little bit of our hope, let somebody borrow a little bit of our imagination. Um, and I'll share a story with you about that before we go any further. I had a colleague who had a client who had schizophrenia, paranoid type it was called back then. He was in his apartment, and my colleague was assigned by the agency to go and check in on him. And he went to his door, and the person wouldn't answer his door, and he wouldn't even speak. And so my colleague John just leaned against the door and said, "Hey, I'm just here to help. I'll check back in with you each week and see if you need anything." Um, and he stood there for 15, 20 minutes and chatted and said things like, and by the way, I later heard this story from the client. We went out to dinner, and he said, John would come to my door and he would say all these things about, when you're working again, or when you're, when you've got your own place, and he was living in a sort of a supported living environment in this apartment. And the client laughed and he said, I thought John was the crazy one. He said, I had psychiatric disabilities, but I thought he was crazy. He was the one talking about when I'm working, when I have my own place. I never thought any of that was possible. But he let me borrow his hope when I didn't have any. I thought that was a really powerful story and an example of how good recovery oriented services can be delivered. So we'll take a look at the techniques and how we might do that. What's good psychiatric rehabilitation or recovery oriented practice? It instills hope, like John did at that doorway, focuses on self determination and empowerment. John was talking to him about what he was interested in, not what John thought was good for him, but what he was interested in doing. Fosters autonomy, connections of the individual's choice, fosters an exploration, resumption of some of those roles that we just talked about. It's centered within the goals of the client. That's fundamentally important. A lot of times, services, especially traditional mental health services, get wrapped up and you got to make your appointments. You got to maintain your meds. And I'll talk a little bit about Pat Deegan and what she talks about the yabbits. She would go to a mental health appointment and she would say, I don't like the way this medication makes me feel. I want to be more active and I feel drugged out. And she would get, yeah, but you're not in the hospital. And what I don't really like the way this plan is working out for me. I'm not doing what I wanted to do. Yeah, but you're stable now. So she calls it getting the yabbits back. And that sort of externally driven, almost paternalistic way of delivering mental health services was the way it was for a long time, and still is baked into the cookie to a degree. And so recentering services around the goals of the client and the strengths of the client, and then that resumption and reclaiming of desired roles is the goal. And if you want to know more about that, by the way, as the presentation goes along, by the way, if you have any questions, pop up a hand. Always happy to talk with you. And then anything that I reference as we go along will be referenced in the bottom, and there'll be a link. And I'm happy to send this presentation out to you as well. I want to explore something that you don't often hear about in psychiatric rehab, and that is self-determination theory. Ryan and DC, for many, many, many years now, probably close to 30 years, have been talking about the idea that intrinsic motivators are more time stable, likely to be embraced than external motivators. If Veronica, I can see your name, so I'm going to pick on you for just a second, if that's all right. If I was doing a presentation like I am now, and we were in person, and Veronica was sitting in the audience, I'm sure Veronica's a very nice person. If I said, "Hey, Veronica, hey, my back's bothering me. Would you carry my bag out to my car? I mean, it's just really bugging me. I'll give you $5." Now, if Veronica does that 10 times, and I don't know if you have a calculator on you, Veronica, I do. That means you got $50 of mine in your pocket. And the question that I would ask is, after 10 times, after 100 times, are you more or less likely to to do it again? Now you got $50 in your pocket. You do it 100 times, you got $500 in your pocket. Veronica, if you want to tell us, are you more or less likely to do it the next time, the more money you got in your pocket?
Yes.
Less, 100%. Thank you, Veronica. I appreciate you playing along here. Yeah, 100% less, because you now have so many external rewards that my external reward is decreasing in value. And the truth is that if Veronica started to help me to my car because it was deeply important to help an old guy out to his car, well, she's more likely to do it longer. She's more likely to do it for a long time because it's meeting an internal value of hers, right? Intrinsic motivators, much more time stable, much more likely to be adopted as a way of doing things. And the client's idea is the best idea. That's what drives services, the best services and choices, and the most time stable services and choices. Again, if you want to read more about self determination theory, there's a link down there in the bottom. So let's talk a little bit about, how would we know? How would we know where somebody is with regard to what we call the stages of change? So Prochaska and DiClemente came up with the idea, Norcross as well, of the stages of change. So as somebody is considering change in their life, and hold this up, Patricia, Chris, Veronica, Those are the only people I can see right now. So that's the names I'm going to use. You think of a change that you made in your life, a big decision that you were thinking about making, and probably at some point you were in that yellow stage where, I'm just not even thinking about that yet. It's not time to do that. I don't have a need to do that right this second. That's pre-contemplation. That's before you're even thinking about stuff. That's a stage that frustrates the heck out of most mental health practitioners, I can tell you. And the truth is that there's a very specific skill that we're going to talk about in a little while that we can reach for in that stage that's much more effective than many of the skills that we get taught. We get really excited as behavioral health professionals, mental health counselors, social workers, rehab counselors, voc rehab counselors. We get real excited when somebody's in contemplation, they're thinking about making change, or they're in preparation, or they're in action. That's our wheelhouse, right? We love that. That's where we feel most comfortable. But man, when we get down in, and even in maintenance, we're good. We're good. We can help somebody to keep that job. We can help somebody to keep working towards the change they've developed. But man, it hit the relapse stage or that, again, that pre-contemplation stage, because folks, this stuff isn't linear, right? People can go back and forth. You've done it. If you've ever lost weight, if you've ever gone on a health challenge, right? You moved all the way through this stage, and then maybe you relapsed a little bit, right? And maybe you got to a point where you were back in pre-contemplation about the whole thing. Stage change works that way for human beings. It's not a linear process. We don't move through a process and stay places. We kind of go back and forth. What stage-wise interventions mean is that we can reach for the right skill at the right time. And so we'll talk a little bit about the stages of change as we move along, but we'll do a little bit of practice, and usually we do this out loud. But so if I said, "Hey, you know what? I'm thinking about. I want to get healthy. I really want to get healthy, but yeah, not right now. I'm too busy. There's too much. There's too much in my life happening right now." Where would you say, and just shout it out there, where would you say I am? Am I in the contemplation stage? Am I in the preparation stage, action stage, maintenance stage? What do you think? Anybody got a guess?
Prep.
Say that again, Cindy. I didn't hear you.
Sorry, prep.
Yeah, maybe prep, right? It may be prep because I'm thinking about it, right? So might be contemplation, right? Prep is really, Cindy, when if I said, yeah, and you know what? I bought a new exercise bike. It's coming. Or I'm thinking about buying an exercise. I'm researching. That's prep, right? Contemplation might be, you know what? I'm really thinking about getting healthy again. I'm thinking about that. Boy, as counselors, rehab counselors, we get excited about that, don't we? We know how to hit the ground running there. That's somebody who's in contemplation. They're thinking about stuff. If we're in the next stage in that preparation, we're starting to research things. Fantastic, we got it. But if I said, yeah, there's no reason for me to even think about exercising right now. I don't have time, and I'm not even thinking about that. Where am I in the stages of change, do you think? No reason to even think about it. I don't have a problem with that. Anybody ever hear that from a client? Bet you have. That's pre-contemplation, folks. That's where somebody's in pre-contemplation. Fortunately, and a lot of times as rehab counselors, and I was a vocational counselor. I was a counselor at South Carolina Vocational Rehabilitation for a little while. I heard that from clients. And it's easy to get kind of a little bit deflated at that point and say, wow, this person's not motivated. This person's resistant to change. By the way, resistant and oppositional are words that we made up for clients that piss us off. They don't do what we think they should do. There's all those words mean. Somebody's resistant, somebody's oppositional, somebody's resistant to change. Actually, what they're expressing is that they're at a different stage of change. What they're expressing is there's a different skill that we should be reaching for. So when somebody's in that pre-contemplation stage, one of the best things that we can do, we'll get to this. This is a little bit of a quiz. But one of the best things we can do if somebody's in the pre-contemplation stage is do something we call values clarification, right? We can explore, hey, Veronica, what's most important to you about Like, what would you most want to get out of our work together? Patricia, what's most important to you about working through this process? That's values clarification. That's the perfect thing to reach for when it comes to somebody in pre-contemplation. We'll talk about why here in a little while. So here's a quiz. Shout out your answers, please. Until a person is motivated to change, there's not much we can do. How vote for true. Veronica, you unmuted. So what do you got?
I'd say false,
You
but
say false. You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. Because the truth is that that's somebody that I just described, right? Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. There's nothing. I don't even need to worry about it. There's plenty we can do. We can do values clarification. We can help that person begin to talk with us about what's important to them. Do this later when you're home with somebody that you trust. Please do it with somebody you trust. Don't do it with anybody you don't trust. Stand palm to palm, facing each other, and pick one of you. You pick the other person. Ask them to push. Right? You push their palms against you and ask them to push. Notice what happens to your body. My guess is that you're going to drop your right or left foot back, and you're going to push back because you're not going to want to get pushed over, right? That's human beings, folks. We don't like to get pushed around. We don't like to get convinced to do something. We don't like to get pushed to do something. We tend to prefer to be able to do that ourselves. And the truth is, people will come much more quickly through the change process if we just reverse things. So when you do that later, you say, okay, you push me. And let that person make sure there's nothing behind you now. I don't want you falling down. Let that person push you. And what you might realize is when that person's moving towards you and their palms are on yours, you can steer. You can let this hand move back and you'll move to the right. And you let this hand move back, you'll move to the left. We can steer if somebody's energy is moving towards us. We can engage somebody's energy to move towards us by using something like values clarification. So what Bill Miller would say, who's the developer of motivational interviewing, is the only thing that matters from a change standpoint is change talk, the amount of change talk somebody engages in. In order for that to happen, that person has to be talking. So if you ever get to a point where you're working with someone and you're trying to work from a motivational interviewing standpoint, recognize that if you're talking, it's probably not the right thing. If they're talking, it is the right thing. Now, there's things we can do, there's things we can say, there's ways that we can sort of shape the process, but recognize that the goal is in motivational interviewing is fostering change talk, and we'll get to that. We'll get to how to do that. Usually, it takes a significant crisis or hitting bottom to motivate a person to change. True or false? What do you think about that? Patricia, how about you? What do you think? True or false? Sorry, Patricia, I can see you. So you got picked. Well, we might not have Patricia. Anybody else want to take a shot at that? Does it hitting bottom, is that true or false?
You're getting a lot of falses in the chat.
False is excellent. I can't see the chat well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The last time you made a big change in your life, you probably didn't need to hit bottom first. Last time you bought a car, last time you made a health change, for example, you probably didn't hit bottom before you did that. Nice work, folks. Motivation is influenced by human connections. That's true. That's true. People do better when they're socially connected. Resistance to change arises from deep-seated defense mechanisms. Anybody? Anyone? False. Yeah. False. Defense mechanisms, not that they don't exist, but they're another example of a concept we came up with to try to suss out why we were frustrated, why people weren't doing what we thought they were going to do. Resistance to change is normal, folks. It's not a deep-seated defense mechanism. You're resistant to change too. If I said, I could make anybody resistant to change right now. If I said to Christine Sacco Benny, listen, Chris, I don't love that shirt you're wearing today. The first thing she would think of, now I know Chris pretty well. Can think of a couple of things she might say. But the first thing she's going to think of probably is, man, I this shirt, I like this shirt. I like the color. I got it on sale. she immediately is going to the reasons why it's important to her, right? We wouldn't need to, we could foster that resistance by pushing, right? There's better ways to do it. There's better ways to help Chris to think about how she wants to present herself if she needed to do that. And she doesn't. She looks fine. People choose whether or not they will change, true or false. Yeah, so Susan, you're right. True. Absolutely, people choose it. But they don't always they don't always choose what we want them to. And that gets us frustrated from time to time. Readiness and change involves a balancing of pro and con. Anybody want to weigh in on that? That's probably true. That's probably true. Last time you bought a car, right? You didn't do that on a whim, probably. You thought about it for a little while. You balanced it out. Does it fit with my budget, etc. Creating motivation for change usually requires confrontation. Getting some falses. You're exactly right. That's false. In fact, what Bill Miller would say, and I had lunch with Bill Miller in 2014. That's my big claim to fame, folks. That's it. That's it. Just as good as it gets for me. We had lunch in New Mexico in 2014, and he said they had just finished the study among Master of Motivational Interviewing practitioners. Now, these are folks who are trained, who are the trainers of the trainers, and they analyzed their sessions with clients. As confrontive behaviors went up, change talk went down. And change talk, by the way, if I haven't said it already, change talk is the one factor that loads for client change. And what Bill Miller would tell you is it's the only factor that loads for client change. So the amount of change talk a client engages with predicts whether they'll change or not, predicts whether the outcome. And so isn't it interesting that as confrontive behaviors go up, change talk goes down, outcomes go down? That's very different than what we're used to in, say, addictions treatment, substance use treatment. The traditional approach is a confrontive approach. You got to stop, you're going to die, you know? So it's a reframe, a little bit of a reframe in terms of the way we approach things. When someone is non-compliant, they have no interest in change. True or false? False. You guys are pros. You guys are pros. I didn't catch anybody. Bummer. Denial is not a client problem. It is a counselor skill problem. What do you think? That is 100% true. It is a counselor skill problem. We just oftentimes, when we think, oh, denial, it's not a river in Egypt, our client is in denial, we think that's a client problem. It's not. We're just frustrated. We don't know what skill to reach for. So let's take a look at that. This is a motivational technique that a guidance counselor once used with me when I was in Catholic school. It's a true story. I was in Catholic school. I was sitting down with a sister, Anne Mark, who did not like me one little bit. And this is what she told me. I'll never amount to anything. She said those words to me. So when I found this cartoon, I thought I'd share with you. This is probably not the way to do it. I just wanted to share one not way to do it. Backwards wording, gotcha. I get it. I get it. All right. So this is another thing that we would do. If we were doing this in person, we'd ask, let's say, Adrienne, we would ask her to pair up with Patricia. We're not going to do this, but we would ask Adrienne and Patricia to pair up, and we would say, okay, Adrienne, I need you to work with Patricia. Patricia's going to role play a client. And what your job is going to be, Adrienne, is to convince Patricia to do what it is that we think that she should do. You need to tell her about the change, how important it is, how good it is for her. And we would do this. Typically, we do this for 3, 4, 5 minutes. And sometimes people convince that person to change. But what's interesting is when we ask the person who was being convinced, who's playing the client, how likely are you to continue this? They're like, I agreed to do it for right now, but I'm never doing this again. Right. And so that's the idea that externally driven change that we so get tempted into when we're rehab counselors. We so get tempted in, this is the right job for you. This could be wonderful. This could be the perfect thing. We can see the possibilities for that person. We're going to convince them how important it is for them. If it's not their idea, it's not the best idea. It's something to think about. So we'll come back to that concept as we go along. And then what I would ask that person is, how willing do you think this client will be to change their behavior as a result of this intervention that we just did? And most people say, yeah, I've managed to convince them, but I wasn't, maybe 4 or 5. I wasn't 100% sure that person would continue to do it. Then we ask the client, they usually report a little bit less, because we're operating in the wrong direction. So kind of going back to that palm to palm visual thing. We pushed, and the person naturally pushes back a little bit. Whereas if we can change that dynamic, we'll probably get a better result. So let's take a look at how we do that. This is motivational interviewing. It's a client-centered, evidence-based, goal-oriented method for enhancing intrinsic motivation for change. That's a really vital thing. And that's Bill Miller, by the way, that you're seeing on your screen there. I'm going to close the chat here is in my way, so I need to move that. I hope you're not seeing that chat, and it's not in your way too. But that's Bill Miller. The spirit of that is collaboration, evocation, autonomy, respect, and compassion. We'll talk about why that's important as we go along. What motivational interviewing isn't is a series of techniques. It's not technique, it's a different way of being with a client. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go along here from a skill perspective. Here's that spirit we talked about: collaboration, evocation, acceptance. Those are all the critical features that we know help people to make change. Fundamentally, we're going to honor the client's autonomy. Acceptance is a critical part of that. I'm having trouble moving this chat box here. Again, I hope that's not in your way. It certainly is in mine. But we're going to collaborate. We're going to evoke as much as we can. Evocation is the idea that we're going to invite somebody to keep talking to us about what's important to them, about maybe even start to focus ideas, maybe even start to help somebody to plan. The mistake that people make, almost everybody does it. I did it. I still do it, is moving too fast through that process. From evocation of values, of getting somebody engaged and excited about change, we move way too fast into focusing, way too fast into planning. Walk into a car dealership. Next time you're wondering whether that's a good idea, walk into a car dealership, start looking around, and they'll almost immediately ask you if you want to take a test drive. They'll almost immediately ask you, let's get a copy of your driver's license. Why don't we sit down with the sales manager? You're not ready for any of that. You're just thinking about that, right? That sort of resistance to change, we can evoke that too when we move too quickly. And we'll talk about what that looks like from a skill standpoint. What motivational interviewing is, not a series of techniques. It's client value driven, it's client centered, and it's client driven. That's a fundamentally important thing to keep in mind as we move forward. Here's the shift, and it's a big shift. We're moving from feeling responsible for client change and their behavior, and we're moving into supporting them and thinking and talking about their own reasons and means for making behavior change. That's the big shift. And there are times when it's hard, right? Because sometimes we can see what would be really good for that client in that moment. And it's hard for us to move from that space, like, oh, I could see what might be important for this person. It's hard for us to make the shift to, let me just support them in thinking this through and talking about it. Again, when the client's talking, that's when good stuff happens, not necessarily when we're talking. So we engage, we focus, and I would say if you're going to stay anywhere, stay in these two spaces. If you're unsure, Then we get into evoking, then we get into planning, right? So engaging, focusing, that's focusing on their values, what's important to them, what might be most valuable to them about this process. We're evoking as much of that as we can. Only then do we get into planning. We don't get into planning until folks get more into the contemplation or preparation stage. If you jump to planning too soon, which we've all of us done as rehab counselors, if we're honest with ourselves, because we're task oriented, right? We need to get stuff done. When we get to planning too fast, that's when we get resistance. And that resistance isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's that person communicating a need that, like, I'm not there yet. I'm not at that stage of change yet. And so we need to back up and kind of go back into engaging and focusing. What are the basic skills of motivational interviewing? Here they are. You're going to, there's oars on the screen for a reason. So open-ended questions, affirmations, open-ended questions. And we'll practice this a little bit. If I said to Cindy, if I said to you, well, don't you think it would be a good idea to make a change? Is that an open or a closed-ended question, Cindy?
Closed.
Closed, 100%. If Cindy, I said, hey, Cindy, what are some reasons why this might be a good idea for you? Is that open or closed?
That's open.
That's open, right? Open-ended questions foster ideas. The idea is Cindy then is going to, the invitation, the social contract, Cindy, talk to me about this. Say more. When Cindy's talking, good things are happening. When I'm talking, less good things are happening. One of the exceptions is affirmations. If I can say, Cindy, I really appreciate you sharing that with me. It's amazing. It's so cool. I appreciate that about our relationship, that we can have these conversations. There's a concept in motivational interviewing, kind of hides behind the scenes, and it's a reinforcement concept. And I like to think about it in a fishing analogy. You get more of what you reinforce, right? You get what you fish for. So if we reinforce Cindy really sharing with us and talking with us, we're going to get more of that. That's the nature of working with people. And I get the question all the time. What about adolescents who are just sort of um, who are clammed up? They're not talking to anybody. Motivational interviewing works beautifully with adolescents. There's nothing an adolescent craves more than, especially if they like you a little bit, if you got that relationship, than affirmation. So affirmations, catch them doing something right. Talk about it, celebrate it a little bit. You'll get more of it. Reflections. Reflections are a key part of motivational interviewing. So instead of asking a question necessarily, so if Cindy says, I don't know, I'm thinking about maybe going back and going back to work. I'm not 100% sure. I could ask a question. What kinds of work are you thinking about, right? That might get my rehab brain thinking about, well, like what job types, what's available. I would encourage you to hold the task and engage with the reflection. Seems a little hesitant, it's maybe there's a little bit of hesitation there. Let Cindy explore that, right? That's that decisional balance that we talked about, the balancing the pros and cons. Cindy might have some trepidation about that. If we notice that in Cindy, reflecting that you seem a little nervous about this, let's talk about that. That's going to help Cindy move much more quickly through the decisional process, through the stages of change. And in fact, that's what we see when Bill Miller first developed this concept, and Stephen Rolnick, they would tape their sessions and they sent the tapes to a neurolinguist. The neurolinguist called them back and said, stop screwing around. You're sending me ringers. Nobody moves through the process this quickly. Well, it turns out they did, because what they were doing was they were using open-ended questions. They were affirming. They were using reflections. They were helping Cindy to talk about, yeah, this is a little bit, I'm a little bit nervous about it. All right, I get that. I get that, but you seem excited too, right? There's another reflection. Yeah, I am excited. How come? That's change talk. Suddenly, Cindy's engaged in telling us why that might be a good idea. And we're going to look at how we categorize change talk in a couple minutes. But now we have Cindy moving towards us. Now we can steer. Now we have her energy moving towards change. And that's a really important process. And then the final one here is summarizing. So when Cindy gets to the end of her statement, we can gather those flowers up and hand them back to her, and with the ones we want to hear more about on top. Hey, I heard you talk a lot about, being a little bit ambivalent, and that's understandable. And then I heard you talk about how excited you are about this potential change. The invitation there is, tell me more about the excitement, right? And so we use summarization to to sort of bait that double end. That what's called a double-sided reflection, by the way. One side of the reflection is always the sustained side. That's the first side, right? So you're nervous about this. It's totally understandable. In the end, what we're asking is the last note that rings. So the last flower that we're handing Cindy in the summary is, and you're excited about this. Tell me a little bit more about why you're excited. So we're helping somebody to engage in change talk by using those ORS concepts. Use more reflections than you use questions. You'll get better results. Change talk is the key component of MI practice. The higher the change talk, the more likely to positive outcome. That is a really consistent metric across the board. The higher the confrontation, the lower the change talk. So again, it's just something to think about. And I know that I'm going to probably wrap at about 10 minutes till, because I want to have some time for questions, but there's lots more slides and I want to make sure that we get to certain things. So again, kind of looking at the fundamental skills, open-ended questions, affirmations. Open-ended questions are exploratory. They're going to help Cindy to talk. And Cindy, thanks for being such a good sport, by the way. Affirmations, we're going to catch Cindy doing something right, and we're going to point that out, and hopefully we're going to reinforce that. We're going to get more of that. We're going to use reflections to help Cindy to really, from her own perspective, and that's the important. If you remember that back to the beginning, right? The experience with people with psychiatric rehabilitation, psychiatric disabilities they don't get a whole lot of chance to talk from their own perspective. And when they do, sometimes they're deflected or redirected, worse. So it's important that they get that space. And then finally, going into summaries help people with psychiatric disabilities specifically and very intentionally. Sometimes people with psychiatric disabilities, one of the experiences is the cognitive sort of disordering that comes with being able to track thoughts or flights of thoughts and those kinds of things. Summarization is one of the key recovery skills of helping Cindy to sort of recognize, oh yeah, that's what I was thinking about, and then helping her to retrack on what's most important to her. People with psychiatric disabilities may have some cognitive organization deficits, but I've never met anybody with a psychiatric disability that didn't have wants, desires, needs, that didn't have things that were important to them. And that's what we want to tap into. All right. Open-ended questions invite exploration. They permit and encourage clients to explore their thoughts. And there's a couple of examples. What's worrying you most today about your job situation? What are some of the not so good things about your job? Again, helping that person to explore the decisional balance just a little bit. What things have you tried in the past to help you to keep jobs? This is very rehab oriented, these questions. So here's an open or closed quiz. We just did this a little bit ago. If you were to quit, how would you do it? That's an open question, right? Can't be answered with a yes or no. Don't you think it's time for a change? That's the one we used earlier. That's a closed question. What do you already know about how to drink safely? What do you already know about keeping your job? Right? Open-ended question helps somebody to explore. Is this an open-ended question? No, of course not. It's a closed question. So just an example of some of those attributions or affirmations, commenting positively on an attribute. Really loved your willingness to share. Really appreciate your willingness to come in and talk with me about this. It's a statement of appreciation. Catch them doing something right. It's a compliment. It's an expression of hope, caring, or support. That aspect of it is especially helpful in psychiatric rehab. Again, remember that lived experience people have: loss of connection, loss of hope, loss of connection. Expressions of hope, caring, or support is what helps people to recover. Rusanova in 1999 operationalized hope as a factor in recovery-oriented care. To that point, it was thought to be just the sort of the soft concept of, oh yeah, you give people hope. Rusanova actually operationalized that as a factor in the recovery process. Expressions of hope matter, and they're a best practice. And so affirmations can be a part of communicating that. You develop a hypothesis with reflective listening, healthcare practitioner, that's what HCP means. And then in your reflection, you can test that out. When in doubt, listen. Don't talk. Listen and reflect. And reflecting, we're reflecting back what the person gives us. It keeps the client thinking and talking about change. That's why reflections are a little bit more helpful in a lot of cases than questions. Questions, you got to remember, sometimes are about our curiosity and they can take the client off of their line of thinking. A reflection is exactly what that person was talking about. And so it keeps them within their own story. Again, people with psychiatric disabilities can benefit specifically from that. They're easy to get sidetracked. And if we can use reflections to keep somebody within their own frame of reference, it can be really helpful to helping that person to explore change. And it shows you're trying to understand. It emphasizes the positive statements about changing. They hear it twice. And it also tends to diffuse resistance a little bit. Um, I don't want to get too deep into crafting reflective statements because we're up against time. I want to get to recognizing change talk as a key component to the training. But essentially, when you can ask any question you can ask turns up at the end, doesn't it? Right? That's a question, goes up at the end. But to make it a reflection, sometimes it's as simple as turning it down at the end. So if I said to Cindy, you seem pretty upset about this. That's a question, right? She can answer yes or no. But if I said to Cindy, you seem upset about this, that's a reflection. The social contract indicates that Cindy should talk more about that, right? So it gets, hopefully, that just the inflection turning down at the end gets Cindy to talk some more. It's a trick. But so if you're interested in quitting smoking or you're interested in quitting smoking, one's a reflection, one's a question. Question can be answered a yes or no. It's a closed question. The reflection is an invitation to talk more. We'll get more into that, but I'm going to skip through here because I want to get to the darn cat. I think it's real important that we talk a little bit about the darn cat. The darn cat is a critical aspect of understanding. There's open-ended questions again. I have much more. We talked about double-sided reflections. Let me talk a little bit about this concept. The research behind motivational interviewing is very clear. The more a person argues on behalf of one position, the more they become committed to that position. So we want to avoid questions like, why don't you want to change? Because we're fostering then sustained talk, aren't we? Cindy's just going to talk to us about why she doesn't want to change. Patricia's just going to talk to us about why it's a terrible idea, why she can't. Rather, how can you tell me you don't have a problem? Very judgy, right? Veronica's just going to bail on us, right? She's going to shut down. She's going to get into put her armor on and get into her own position. What makes you think you're not at risk, right? That's that writing reflex that we have. What we could produce with that is people who are oppositional and discounting and defensive and justifying and feeling like they're not understood. You've seen this. I've done it. I mean, early in my career, I would do this because, sort of that's the instinct that we have. But we have a different choice set. We could reframe, for example. So I've tried to change so many times and failed, Patricia might say. And we might say, you're really persistent, even in the face of discouragement. This change must be really important to you. So we're reorienting back to the value, reorienting back to what might be important to a person. Why it works? You're essentially teaching the client how to think in a way that fosters some positive change. You're building their confidence to pursue change. So let me get here to, I'm going to take us out of this for a second. I'm going to take us right back in, I promise, but I want to get to the darn cat. This is a really important concept. So when somebody is engaged in speaking with us, if Veronica's talking to us, we can recognize change by using this acronym of the darn cat. If Veronica's talking about her desire, her ability, her reason or need, her commitment, her action, or taking of steps, that's a really important concept, right? Desire is the shallowest, right? I want to do this. I want to do this. The depth of, she's not close yet. She's not close yet. But if she starts talking about her ability to make change, now she's thinking about it. She's thinking about whether she can. She's thinking about whether she's able to do this. When she starts talking about reasons, That's when we're getting closer. Now, I don't know if you have a cat at home or if you know cats, but the as you pet a cat, you can pet a cat's head. They're pretty cool at that. And as you get lower on the cat, you're getting closer to action. Some clients like a good butt scratch, and some not so much. That as you get lower in this list, as you go desire, ability, reason, need, commitment, action, taking steps, what you'll notice is you get closer and closer and closer to action, just like when you're petting a cat. So as we're hearing somebody talk, if they're talking about their desire, they're early days in the process. If they're talking about their ability, a little closer. Reason, even better. Need, yeah. Now we're into a space where they're really thinking about they need to do this. They're getting close to making that commitment. I intend to, I plan to. Or activation, I'm doing this today. I'm going to order equipment. I'm going to look for a job. I'm going to do whatever. And then taking steps. I went to my first group. Um, that's where you got real action. So when you're thinking about motivational interviewing, thinking about the stage of change, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, relapse, where is somebody in that process? And then intentionally using our skills to engineer somebody talking to us, engaging in change talk, not sustained talk, not I don't want to do this. There's reasons I can't do this. We want to talk about the reasons why it might be important to them. We want to talk about the reasons why it might be a good idea. We want somebody to talk to us about their ambivalence about it. Let them do some processing about that. They'll move through the stages of change much more quickly if we give them that judgment-free space to be able to do that. Again, it's a client-centered, a person-centered, client-centered, client-driven change process. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of that aspect. So let's do a quiz, very quick quiz. I want to have better relationships. That's a desire statement. I want, right? If you're hearing somebody talk about what they want, that's desire. I think I might be able to do it. That's ability. They're starting to think about their ability to make that change, and you can start to see how much closer somebody gets. My husband and I hope to have a family. That's a reason, right? So now there's a reason for the change to happen. I really need to feel better about me. That's somebody who's very close to making a change in that direction. I'm going to make this happen. Now they've made a commitment. I'm making an appointment with a counselor. I'm taking steps. It's action now. And I went to see the counselor today. I've done it. I'm in. So the darn cat is a wonderful reference point from a motivational interviewing standpoint. The other thing to think about is if somebody's in pre-contemplation, you're probably going to get some desire statements. You might get some ability statements. Help somebody through that process. There's skills that we can use. There's something called a confidence ruler that we can use to help somebody to get through that process. Let me show you the confidence ruler real quick because it's a cool concept that I think you should know about. Here we go. So this is what's called a confidence ruler, and I'm going to teach you how to use it real quick. If Veronica says, and Veronica I can see is just thanks for being such a good sport. If I said, hey, Veronica, how confident are you can make a change? If she was talking about her confidence. And let's say Veronica said a 3. I'm a 3. Our instinct might be, why aren't you higher than that, right? You should be. Always go left. Always go left. So we might say something like, hey, Veronica, a lot of people in your situation, you said a 3. A lot of people would have said a 1, maybe even a 0. Tell me, Veronica, why you're a 3 and not a 1. What we're doing there is we're fostering change talk, right? In terms of confidence. By the way, this same ruler can be used for confidence, readiness, importance, you name it, right? Wherever it is. It could be used for desire. It could be used for ability. It could be used for reason. It could be used for need. And you always go left. And you encourage somebody to talk with you about why they're not less, they're more. Why? Because we're fostering change talk. So that's one of the tricks. By the way, here's the other trick that I use. I never, ever, ever have this pre-printed. I have somebody write it out and draw it out. Why? Because it becomes their tool. Once they realize they can put a 0 and a 10 and some tick marks, and they can pick a number, and they can talk to themselves about why they're not lower, then they're engaging in change talk of their own. And they have a tool that they can use where they're sitting all they need is a pen and a napkin, right? So they can create that tool themselves. I know this was super fast, but we have about 5 minutes for questions, if that's of interest to you. What questions might you have about motivational interviewing or stages of change, or psychiatric rehab and where it fits? And by the way, I'm happy to give you this PowerPoint.
Any questions, folks? Didn't see any in the chat, but we did have somebody say, gosh, they didn't teach MI in my counseling classes. It feels like more of a modern modality.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Cindy, I see your hand up. Let me take your question. Go ahead.
Why don't you finish what you're stating there and then I'll ask the question. How's that?
Oh, sure. What I would say about that is yes, I think you're going to see it more and more in more counseling programs, because it's grown in effectiveness so quickly. It's closing in on CBT in terms of evidence, and that's saying something because it hasn't been around very long. Go ahead, Cindy.
No, it was easier to talk than type here. So I understand that confrontation, basically will shut somebody down or can
Sure,
very well shut somebody down.
sure.
What about putting them in an area of internal conflict within themselves, where they may want to do that pro-con list, or they may say, hey, wait a minute, this is getting a little rough. Maybe I should consider doing something else,
Sure.
which
Yeah,
is a little different than confrontation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's all valid. And there's a little bit of sort of clinical judgment that comes in. Like you might say, Cindy, because sounds like you've been doing this a minute, might say, man, this person's wrestling with this. They probably need to confront that, the process, or they need to confront themselves on this issue. Um, I always like, from a motivational interviewing standpoint, to have them process that. Like, how about I take here's my favorite trick. If I'm going to do that, I'll say, hey, how about I take the con side and you take the pro side? You talk to me about the pros, I'll talk to you about the cons. That way they can confront themselves, and they're still engaged in change talk. And then we can leverage and affirm the change talk and get them talking more about that. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Sure. Other questions? Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you being here. I'll hang around a little bit if you've got questions. Again, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint with you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to spend some time with you here today.
Mike, as always, thank you so much. For those folks who are still on, it was because of members like you who asked Mike to come back after his psychiatric rehab presentation for our webinar series. So good call. Thank you for asking for that. And Mike, as always, we really appreciate all that you offer ARCA and our members. And to our members, thank you very much. And yeah, if you want to stick around, we have a 6 o'clock, or depending on your time zone, um, uh, presentation coming up later today, and then one tomorrow. Thanks so much for being here, all. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody. Take care.